our webinar. Once again, Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar, which is part of the Advancing Education in Muslim Societies series on human development. It started back in 2019 under the International Institute of Islamic Thought. For a full list of other webinars, you can access them freely on the website of the International Institute of Islamic Thought. Forgiveness, which is part of today's topic, is one of the main research constructs that were studied under the empirical research done under Advancing Education in Muslim Societies. Other research constructs studied included gratitude, meaning-making, empathy, sense of belonging, religiosity, among others. And for a full list of all research constructs that were studied, as well as a list of all reports and data conducted as part of the empirical research that was done in 15 Muslim societies, you can access all of that information again freely on the website of the International Institute of Islamic Thought. We are honored to welcome today's guest, Dr. Muhammad Abu Nimr. I can see from the chat that many of you already know Dr. Abu Nimr quite well. Many of you are perhaps close friends. Welcome to you all. But for those of you who don't know Dr. Abu Nimr, he is professor at the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C., where he also serves as director of the Peace Building and Development Institute. He has conducted interreligious conflict resolution training and interfaith dialogue workshops in conflict areas around the world, including Egypt, Northern Ireland, the Philippines, Israel, Palestine, Chad, Nigeria, and Sri Lanka. As a professor with over 35 years of teaching experience, he has developed numerous courses that deal with different facets of peace building and conflict resolution and regularly publishes on the subject. While his research has focused on a wide area of areas in peace building and conflict resolution, his most recent research and areas of focus have included faith-based peace building, interfaith dialogue in peace building and building social cohesion, along with pedagogical considerations on incorporating peace and forgiveness education in the Arab and Muslim worlds. Abu Nimr has been both author and editor of more than 13 books on faith-based and interfaith peace building, as well as interfaith dialogue and its role in peace building and reconciliation. Such books include Nonviolence and Peace Building in Islamic Context, Bridging Ideals and Reality, 2003, Peace Building by, Between and Beyond Muslims and Evangelical Christians, 2009, and Evaluating Interreligious Peace Building, 2021. In addition, he has authored numerous articles in referee journals such as the International Review of Education, the Journal of International and Comparative Education, and the Journal of Religious Ethics, Peace and Change. In addition, Dr. Abu Nimr is the co-founder and co-editor of the Journal of Peace Building and Development. Dr. Abu Nimr will speak to us today about reconciliation and forgiveness, theory and practice in the Arab context. As you know, please share your comments or questions in the chat section, which we will be monitoring, and then we will discuss them and address all your comments and questions after Dr. Abu Nimr's presentation. Without further delay, Dr. Abu Nimr, you are most welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karim. Much appreciate your kind word and also your extensive introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you. And also thank you for the IIIT and for everyone, including Dr. Nasser and Saulat and Bitul for helping to host this public webinar. And I'm delighted that we have a chance to share some of the thoughts and experience regarding the theme of reconciliation, forgiveness, the theory and the practice in Arab society context. I know our time is limited and they gave me about 40 some minutes, so I will try to go directly to the topic and share my screen with everyone here so we can move on. The reason for me in many ways to deal with this is really has to do with more of a personal in many ways. I am been interested in this theme, forgiveness and reconciliation, for over 40 some years, since my teenager days. And I have many personal and also professional cases and the practical experiences in this context. I usually deal with the dialogue and interfaith and religion and diplomacy. But again, I always deal with that through the lens of conflict transformation, reconciliation, and moving people towards better understanding and practice of these values. And today I work mostly through the Salam Institute, for Peace and Justice. It's a nonprofit organization in DC, and we've been dealing with education, capacity building, and interfaith dialogue as well. Work in Chad, Nigeria, and Pakistan, Iraq, many parts of the world, also the Arab region. And my project on reconciliation and forgiveness that I will be sharing in some ways with you is really hosted and will be hosted and already operated from the institute itself with some other colleagues. 4 sections I'm hoping to introduce. One is what is reconciliation and forgiveness. Second one is what does it mean to have Arab region reconciliation and forgiveness? Why now? Why is it important at this period and history and the context to deal with these concepts now? What are the challenges, and some suggestions for way forward that I will be developing and continue to work on some of them, but develop a new one as well. Again, forgiveness in general is a multifaceted, of course, and those are basically images that I got from Google in some ways for association of forgiveness with when people ask what does it mean. Again, happy, fear, conflict, people, rejected, desperate, accepted, a smile. So it has always, and anger as well. The feeling are always integral component of the concept of forgiveness. Reconciliation, on the other hand, is about relationship, together, solidarity, agreement. And as you see, the concept of forgiveness is also in the left corner, my left corner, in reconciliation. The two terms are connected. And first of all, before we look at the connection between them, let me just share with you some of the principles and assumptions that guide our work based on, again, my work is over 35 years of practice in many parts of the world, in many conflict areas, where deeply divided society or identity-based conflict is taking place, and also based on research and empirical research on the topic. Maybe myself and Dr. Nasser done one of the first empirical research and study on forgiveness. I'll speak about it later on, but this is not only my own opinion, subjective opinion. Those assumptions empirically supported and scholarly documented. The first one is that reconciliation and forgiveness processes are similar in their nature and dynamic on the interpersonal and collective level. Some people try to fully separate them and say the collective, the political collective, social. When a society needs to forgive and reconcile, it's very different from interpersonal, and therefore we cannot compare. I come with the assumption of, on the contrary, I think they're very similar and connected, and there are lots of things we can learn from the interpersonal to apply to the collective or macro level forgiveness and reconciliation. Second, cultural and religious norms and values determine the processes, expressions, and narrative of reconciliation and forgiveness. There is no cookie cutter. There is no one template that we can move from Indonesia into Sri Lanka, into Syria, or in Lebanon, or in Palestine, or among Black and white in the US and other parts of the world. Each context, cultural and religious context, dictates in many ways how we approach the reconciliation and how we approach the processes of forgiveness. And this principle is very important because it gives a heavy weight of considerations for the local knowledge, for the local practices, and for people from insider, what we call the insider practitioner, one who can, or a group of people who can really read the codes and the meanings of the culture and religion about reconciliation. There are many successful examples in interpersonal. Yes, we have hundreds, thousands, if not even millions of cases around the world where we can collect, and we collected hundreds of them, over 100 of them in the Arab region as well when we did our research. However, we have very few cases on interstate and in a large societal state. People talk about Germany reconciling with France after the Second World War, again, and that's one form of reconciliation between the French and the German. And even some people, basically doubt whether there was full reconciliation, but there are mechanisms for coexistence, good cooperation. However, on a societal level, on a state level, on a macro level, those cases are still to be documented and also pursued in many ways. Redefining, reframing our sense of justice is a necessary condition for reconciliation. The usually main question faces us in dealing forgiveness and reconciliation is the concept of justice. So from the beginning, we assume no matter what you do, if you want to reach to forgiveness and reconciliation, your sense of what is just need to be reframed, need to be redefined, renegotiated with the other. Any interaction with the other requires that, whether it is husband and wife, or a parents and their children, or it is even with your boss. You have a conflict and you feel so you've been treated unjustly. You need to re-examine, reframe. What do you mean by justice that you need in order for you to reach a reconciliation with the other person? And finally, a reconciliation and forgiveness cannot be imposed. And these can't be imposed by government, can't be imposed by your boss, by your priest, or by your imam, or by your Buddhist monk. Those are basically individual decision. You have to decide to do that. And you see here, I chose from the Quran. We're in Ramadan season, and I chose two actually verses from the Quran that encourages people and pushes people toward forgiveness and reconciliation as well. Let me see if I can. I'm sorry, I have to exit this. Yes. Forgiveness, again, why do we forgive is the motive. What brings people to forgiveness? It mostly for the person himself or herself. It's not about forgiving the other. It's not about the other. Mostly, and for all, the primary reason to forgive is for you. For you to deserve, to get the peace you deserve, to get rid of the burden, emotional burden, to get rid of all the package that you have in which the injury that you suffered, the victimhood that you experience, can be dealt with in a more constructive way. So in many ways, I do believe in that sense. And also this was in many ways empirically supported by forgiveness scholars who did survey, Worthington and others, that one of the main motivation for forgiveness is because people individually decide on that, and it's for their own interest. Now, what is forgiveness and reconciliation, how they're connected? But I boil it down to two items. Basically, it's a new for reconciliation is a new arrangement of inclusion to guarantee respect and acceptance of identity-based diversity. So we have a situation, most of the conflict area we work with, basically people have used their ethnic, racial, gender, religious, sectarian, whatever it is, the identity that they're fighting over, they use the identity in their conflict dynamic, and they basically fight over inclusivity, over inclusion, over the rights to have a part of the resources equal part of the resources, whether it is economic, social, cultural, whatever the resources are. And in reconciliation, we look for a new arrangement for inclusion. We invent those arrangements mutually agreed upon by the parties. And we try to restore and enhance social cohesion on the individual and collective level. So if there was social cohesion before the violence, we try to restore it. If there was no social cohesion, we try to, again, enhance it and build it better. You can think of a conflict that you're having with somebody in your work, in your family, in your environment, in your community, and you can apply some of these basic principles. But in general, there is one group that is dominating the public space, dominating the resources, whether it is Muslim or a Christian or a Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu or black or white, doesn't matter who's this group. But the fact that there is a group that controlling the access to the public space. And here we talk about jobs, we talk about the culture, about and everything that belong to everyone in the society is being dominated, whether it is Sunni Shia in Iraq, or whether I can use many examples from different parts of the world, a Catholic Protestant in Northern Ireland, again Sinhalese Buddhist in Sri Lanka. This group control the resources and dictate the access to the identity. Palestinians and also Israeli Jewish inside Israel, or even also in the West Bank and Gaza in many ways. Creating public and private space that encourage equal access. That's what reconciliation is about, is that we engage in a process that produces a public space and the private spaces that have an equal access and sense of belonging to a shared civic identity. And this definition is about, again, definition about macro society, about access of the minority or those who were victimized to the house, to their own house, whether it is in the family level or whether it is in the public and society level. So B here is what we are after in the reconciliation. How do you get there, and what are the principles that should guide our work? So if you think of a place like Syria now, or if you think of a place like Lebanon, or if you think of a place like Somalia, or if you think of a place like the United States, where black and white, or Native American, the US, and white dominant Anglo-Saxon community or system that deprive these communities from their access to the history, narrative, resources in many ways. And this is historically done through centuries, and this can be done through decades, centuries. The conflict can continue to be deeply rooted. So we talk about collective and individual reconciliation, and the first option, or first school of thought, that reconciliation is not possible without forgiveness. This is a holistic and transformational approach. And it basically, I release you and myself from the burden of the wrongdoing. This is a mutual agreement on forgiveness and on reconciliation. Components for this is apology, recognition, and forgiveness. You need to acknowledge the harm, recognize the wrongdoing, that there was something wrong done. You take responsibility about it. And then you have some remorse, that you're sorry that this happened, and you really regret that this take place, whether you intended or not, regardless. And then the most important thing probably in the relationship, that you guarantee that this will not be repeated, the offense will not be repeated. So whether it is domestic violence or whether it is work related, you want always the assurance from the offender that this will not happen again. And therefore we put rules, we put laws, we send people to prison in order to make sure that they will not repeat their offense. There are many things we always engage in to prevent the repetition of the offense. Finally, granting unilateral or mutual forgiveness. That's why this is holistic and comprehensive. It has forgiveness, mutual or unilateral, whether you forgive alone, regardless what the other person wants, or desire or not, or you have a mutual forgiveness. The person agree and accept your request for forgiveness. That's the ideal, and that's the model or the school. Is one school. The second school is that says reconciliation, whether it is individual or collective, between husband and wife, between children, at work, related, in community. It's possible to do it, and you don't need forgiveness. Forgiveness is an individual decision. Reconciliation it can take place. Therefore, you can recognize in the process of reconciliation, you can acknowledge the harm, recognize the wrongdoing, take responsibility, have remorse, promise, but you don't make any public or a private forgiveness statement. So it's out. The second type of reconciliation without forgiveness is basically what we see in the world today, whether it is South Africa or Northern Ireland or many other parts of the world that they did peace agreements. You have a political regulation to ensure common interest. That it's what we call living together, common interest to live together. We looked at the past partially, or we did not look at the past. It depends on the model. But basically here, you have a problem with your boss and you decide that, again, you want to live together, work together, and you decide about regulation, how to work together after the conflict. And you call this reconciliation because you resume your relationship, but you resume the relationship based on certain common interest and did not go the depth of the forgiveness as well. Many models right now deal with the pragmatic living together, and they don't necessarily require going deep in a deeper level of relationship repair and forgiveness as well. These are two schools, two types of linking and delinking forgiveness. But in general, reconciliation requires two sides. Forgiveness only requires one side. One person can forgive. Reconciliation requires reframing of your own sense of justice, as we mentioned earlier. And genuine reconciliation requires a change in behaviors of the other. You can't say that, we are reconciled, and then you repeat the same offense, or you continue to harm, or you continue to engage in harmful behavior and perceptions toward the other. On the other hand, forgiveness does not mean you have to reconcile. And that's one principle that we already mentioned. Forgiveness is not giving up justice. You can forgive the person or the group, but it doesn't mean that they will not be punished. They'll not be held accountable by God or by the government or by the society or by others. Forgiveness means that you individually are releasing yourself from the burden of the wrongdoing that was done to you, and you don't expect anything from the other side. You don't expect anything from the other person. Now, what will happen to the other person is up to you. It's not up to you in many cases, but society might have the right, the institution might have the right to pursue with that person. But basically, forgiveness is recognizing the hurt, and also you go beyond that. Yes, there is hurt, but I'm not going to allow this hurt to keep me in many ways trapped and cannot move forward with my emotion and with my relationship with other. There are many factors that affect the practice of reconciliation and how the reconciliation is done. The timing of when are we pursuing it, the timing of whether it is after 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, the timing has a huge. Some argue the longer the time when the victim or the wrongdoing was done or the offense, it's easier to reconcile. Other schools say actually on the contrary, the more you leave it, the more it festers and it becomes more difficult to come back and revisit, and the new divides will be created between the two parties. Two people in a community, they are fighting, they offended each other, and one lost had a sense of victimhood. If you deal with the conflict and with the injury within 1 year, it's different than dealing with it then 10 years. And again, depending on the scale, the scope of the victimhood, whether it is, in the case of South Africa and African American race relation here, Native American in the US, you're talking about 300-400 years of victimhood. And we cannot expect to reverse that in one generation or two generation. In Northern Ireland for 200-300 years as well. In Somalia, it's been for over 40 years of a conflict and a tribal confrontation. Afghanistan similarly. Why would we expect such deep-rooted dynamic to be reversed within one generation or even two generations? It involves a small group, personal and large skills. Also, the nature of the transitional of the agreement, how the agreement was done, whether it is, the divorce agreement between couples when they injure each other. The nature of that agreement, of the divorce agreement, can dictate in many ways the path toward reconciliation. Bad agreements mean less possibility for reconciliation. Good agreement, restorative agreement, open-ended agreement, collaborative agreement for separation can pave the way toward reconciliation. And whether access to the past, whether the groups look at the truth and reveal the facts of the injury during the conflict. In Bosnia today, we're still dealing with Srebrenica. We're still dealing with the memories of the genocide in 1994. And as long as there is no thorough examination of that, the history will continue to haunt the Bosnian Muslim and the Serbian and the Croatian who were engaged in that conflict. The justice mechanism, whether did we use in the process of the agreement and the reconciliation, restorative or punitive? Restorative to restore relation. Punitive is to be guided by punishment. I'll go quickly here. Nonviolence, respect for diversity, humanizing the other, critical thinking, self-examination, and problem solving. These are the 5 core competencies that anyone engaged in reconciliation needs to practice them. That's the practice part. And we know that from our training of teachers, training of students, training of interfaith dialoguers, training of civil society. We know that from research and from practice. The more we deepen these 5 values and 5 practices, the more reconciliatory the person can become, and the relationship can also be improved. And they also relate to some of the value competency that the IIIT, of course, been dealing with. Well, what are we looking for beyond the values? In the reconciliation process, we look for a new nonviolent mechanism to jointly respond to the future conflict. We want to ensure the conflict is not repeated. So, of course, the rule of law has to be in place, constitution, court, law, security, all of that need to be in place as a result of the agreement. So wife and husband cannot resume their relation after a fight without clear accountability in their agreement, clear aspect of what we will do in the next time we have a conflict. Community, small community, the same. Peer mediation, ADR, community dialogue, and also to celebrate the constructive, uplifting social and cultural rituals. I'll come back to that later on when we talk about the Arab culture. But these are at least 5, 6 component, practical one of what does it mean to have a reconciliation and the relationship based on reconciliatory arrangement. Why in the Arab region forgiveness? Again, Lebanon, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, Tunisia, and Yemen. And these are 11 countries that 10 or 11 countries that I've counted that they all deal with deeply divided society in some ways, and the identity been deployed, and they have some elements of violence already engaged in the society. The remaining 10 other Arab countries also have more conflicts and also have some form of violence, but some of it is again is not as active as now. It doesn't mean that these processes don't apply to them. But these countries all deal with the transitional justice aspect, meaning that the government is in the middle of deciding how the new governance system will take place, and whether this governing system is going to be responsive to the people need and to the group, to the collective need. Why do we need this? Because from research, we know that if in a transitional justice situation, right now, it's all mostly legal and legislative. What type of government and what type of laws and what type of election you will have. And mostly there are elements of a punitive approach. How are we going to punish those who did wrong to us? And I am suggesting here, and we're basically putting on the table also, that these challenges of social cohesion, ethnic divides, fragmentation in these societies, whether it is ethnic, religious, sectarian, regional, whatever it is, political, those cannot be dealt only by the transitional justice, typical legal and legislative approach. We need to inject reconciliation and forgiveness in this process. We need to inject it as early as possible, because we know that from Germany, we know that from Chile, we know that from Guatemala, we know that from South Africa, we know that from many other countries, that they basically succeeded in some ways to the degree in which they included reconciliation processes and forgiveness in their negotiation or in their approach. Otherwise, our option will be to continue and be stuck in the middle or in this closed circle of revenge, of aggression, act of aggression, victim, and then pain, and then anger, and then suppression of grief, loss of meaning, desire to retaliate, and then we retaliate. And this cycle of violence, you can see it playing in front of you in many Arab countries, Arab societies, on a local level, on a tribal level in Libya, or in Tunisia, or in Yemen, or in many parts of the world, or in Lebanon. The society is caught into this. The political leaders and the religious leader in some ways pushing toward or continue to perpetuate and fail to get people out of this cycle. In interpersonal relation, the cycle of revenge and aggression among husband and wife and among children of the same family, or within a small community, can usually lead to, again, can continue to be for many years and many decades, and it's very hard to exit from that. The breaking of the cycle of violence starts with acknowledging the wrongdoing, accepting that there is a loss, but mostly rehumanize the enemy. Because throughout the decades that we had the relationship of violence, we dehumanized the enemy. We created walls and we separated people from each other. We separated community. We dehumanized the other to the extent that the other become subhuman, and killing them and hurting them becomes normal, even expected. And we did not engage with them on an equal footing. They either work for us or they either below us, because our religion or our faith or our ethnicity tells us we are better than them, or we deserve more, or they cannot be trusted. All these justification in the relationship leads you to remain within that cycle. We're suggesting that again, there are processes to suppress that guilt and look at the loss and understand that the other side is also a human, and they need to be listened to and they need to be understood as well, despite all the victimhood that continue. And then you go through that process of reconciliation. That process is very difficult to engage in, and it requires individual and institutional arrangement, something we don't have in the Arab society at this point. Institutionally, we did a forgiveness survey with Dr. Nasser and we did about 700 surveys, over 102 interviews. And here is just very quickly, all with Arab teachers in 6 Arab countries. No single class curriculum, separate curriculum, contain lessons on reconciliation and forgiveness. We did not find any. So, and also we we had 96% of the teacher don't know how to introduce the topic in their classes. 91% of the teacher, they said, where will you get the reconciliation and the forgiveness? They said, I'll go back to my faith and religion. That's their resort where they get the inspiration, and that's where they will get the practice as well. 89% believe in conditional forgiveness, and that's an interesting one. They said, I will forgive if the person will receive their punishment. That's the punitive justice. It's you say, I will forgive the person if. Once you put the if, it means there are conditions, and most of the conditions were punitive. Punitive mean, and here is a if the teacher is a punitive in his or her approach, if the teacher does not know how to teach reconciliation and forgiveness, why do we expect to break the cycle of revenge and the cycle of violence that I described before? If the teacher is one of those who continue to perpetuate that cycle, the teacher, the media, as well as the religious institutions, the agencies of socialization, all contribute to the perpetuation of that circle. Why is it difficult to introduce collective, not individual, collective reconciliation between groups, between Muslim, Christian in some neighborhood community in Egypt, or in Iraq, or in Yemen, or in Syria, or in Libya, or in Sudan? In many ways, these countries, 11 in particular that I mentioned, absence of basic security. There is a collapse and dysfunctional of the basic infrastructure. People are in survival mode. And when people are in survival mode, they tend to delay the reconciliation. So they always tell us, look, you talk about reconciliation, forgiveness now, I'm just trying to survive. So push it later until there is more stability. There is very low degree of a trust in the central governance system. If the government is seen, if the governance system is seen as distrustful, cannot respond to the group and the individual needs, why would then I believe their message about reconciliation? I have to retreat back to my primordial identity. I go back to my clan, sect, tribe, religious group, ethnicity, and I seek my security there. And that's what's happening in many Arab society community contexts. Look at, in many ways, Lebanon and many other places. In an office level, I'm going to come back to the office and community. On an office or a small community, when there is a conflict that's so divided, people immediately go back to their families, to their friends, to their allies, in order to seek the security. There is a mental us versus them in the society. Clear divide. You visit the society in many ways from within. There are many of these divides, mental divides, where you are not allowed to reach the other side. And if 1, 2, 3, 4 and A and B take place, you easily find you or your children or yourself caught into the dehumanizing myth. You begin listening to images about Shia and Sunni in Iraq that are unreal. Where did you get these images about the other? Oh, they told us. Oh, I read it in a book. In Lebanon, the same thing. In Yemen, also, you find similar example about the north and the south and the Houthi and the non-Houthi. And these are all myths that have been developed through decades and sometimes centuries in order to continue this separation. They are feeders of helplessness and hopelessness. There is still gender and generational gap. That gap prevents social cohesion and it perpetuates those divides. We distrust the narrative of politicians. I mentioned that. Many politicians in many of these 11 countries and societies have hijacked, manipulated the concept of reconciliation. And they said, I am doing reconciliation, but in fact, what they did was manipulation of the process of reconciliation or national dialogue in Tunisia or in Yemen, as it has done, or in Syria or in Iraq, in many ways in the past 10 years, at least in the past 10 years. The process and the terminology has been hijacked by politicians as well. disenfranchised, segregated, and competing efforts already taking place in the society. And finally, our societies in general in the Arab region and globally is subject to the instant gratification, shallow forms of knowledge. Again, you don't read about the other, you don't learn more about the other. And in many ways, this individualization process pushing us into more disconnection. In the past, in the last 10 minutes here, I think I diagnosed it in many ways in a very disencouraging way, or maybe more discouraging way. Yes, I guess that's the word. But because there is no hope among many people, distrustful, what we want to move into conflict transformation. And as part of the reconciliation, this is something I work with the IMTD, Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy, as early as the 90s, and continue to use similar model. Hope, trust, nourishment, power, community, hearing, learning, and healing, creativity, and the will to engage in these process of change, the notion of diversity and complexity, and get rid of the myths or mythologizing negative mythology that we have developed about the other. Reconciliation process is supposed to be built and injecting these values and these processes in the society. That's how we can transform the society that where conflict has become part of the habits. You have developed community, individual, collective habits that perpetuate the conflict, and therefore we are caught into that cycle of violence. We caught into the cycle of revenge and cycle of negative connection to the other. The job cannot be done by the religious authority number 7, or by the donors, or by the government, or by the business, or the educator. The job of reconciliation need to happen and involve track 1 and all those tracks together. And it's an illusion, and in many ways manipulation of reality and misdiagnosis to say religious people need to fix there because they are the reason, or the business people are the one who are causing this, or the government. All these are inaccurate in my view to blame one track, one agency. The Arab societies dynamic face this aspect of cycle of revenge and cycle of trap, because all these tracks contribute to it. From government, from non-government, NGOs, business, private citizen, researcher, and activist, and religion, and funding, and media in the middle as well, connecting many of these tracks. In many ways, in my view, I have seen this also in the past 3-4 decades of work. All these tracks, all these agencies contribute to the perpetuation of the violence. You just need to look at the business practices. You just need to look at the research, education system, look at the religious institutes, and ask each one of them, how did you contribute to the perpetuation of the conflict? We know from other conflict area as well, not only here, Bosnia, South Africa, I mentioned them all. Reconciliation will not take place without political agreement alone. Reconciliation process has to be integrated prior to the, again, as early as possible in the process of politics. And also institutional reform should not be symbolic. Should be indeed adaptive, and reform need to take place. The education has to integrate reconciliation and forgiveness in its core. We know that from Northern Ireland and Lebanon after the Taif Agreement. Minimal forms of accountability for the past. You cannot, again, leave the past totally, ignore that it happened, the victimhood. You need to go back and see what happened in the Algerian context during 1994, during the 90s, in order to be able to move forward. You need to look at what happened in the conflict in Lebanon in the past 40, 50 years in order to be able to understand and move forward. Generations will not necessarily forget. They will remember, and we want them to remember in a constructive way rather than destructive way. We need to, the state cannot do this alone. Civil society need to be included, and religious actors need to be involved, and also social and cultural spaces need to be able to provide the safe encounter. In many of these countries, including the US, it is rarely that you find a safe space where people can come together and speak about those divisions, about the cycle of revenge, about the conflict, about the division in the society. And these are the dialogical spaces that are missing in any given society, as in any given conflict. Youth and women are one of the largest marginalized group, and they are basically constitute the at least 2/3 of the society or half of the society. You cannot move the society in a reconciliation without having an active role of those, particularly those two vulnerable and marginalized groups. Examples in the Arab region where in the past 10 years, whether it is Kurdish, Iraqi women talking about reconciliation in the top, or parliamentarian Libyan women joining the reconciliation discussion, or women in Bahrain also talking and sending message about the need for reconciliation. There are some positive examples that taking place, forces in the society that pushing toward the genuine reconciliation. And based on that, I've suggested 5 or 6 areas for how we can push the theme of reconciliation and forgiveness in the Arab world. Intervention on diagnose, to name, confront, and stand up to the blockers of reconciliation. Your family member, your workplace, your community place. You reach within your limit to whatever your hand or word can reach. Each one can be trained to diagnose and name and confront instead of deny, avoid, accommodate, or collaborate with the cycle of revenge and the cycle of violence. These are the choices for an individual choice. And this is in relationship on the office, in community, also in the family. You can diagnose and name, or you can avoid and pretend it doesn't have, or live in denial. The more denial we live in, the more the conflict will be perpetuated. We look at the programs of strategic targeting. There are three major institutions today: religious actors, media and social media, and formal and informal educational agencies. These are the 3 huge agencies, and I'm leaving the politics out of this at this point here. I'm looking at areas where religious actor, media, and formal, in many ways, can influence strategically, if we target them, can influence strategically the discourse on reconciliation and forgiveness. We need to build local knowledge on reconciliation, forgiveness. A think tank, policy centers, university, research centers, that knowledge does not exist in the Arab societies about the processes of reconciliation, forgiveness. I'm not talking about a preacher, an imam or khatib on a Friday, or a preacher on Sunday will go and preach about forgiveness and reconciliation. I'm talking about empirical ways of developing the knowledge, the local knowledge about reconciliation and forgiveness, to engage in that so we have a localized knowledge and not only imported from other conflict area. Build the spaces for engaging policymaker with non-state actor for reconciliation and forgiveness. So in Tunisia, Sudan, and in Yemen, in Libya, in Iraq, again, we lack those spaces where policymakers and non-state actors, here talk about faith-based organization, civil society, institutional arrangement, where that interaction is taking place. But to speak about one specific topic, reconciliation and forgiveness, that is not on the national agenda. That is not on the level of systematic intervention, but it's a lip service in many ways, because in many ways I thought it was already hijacked in the past decade by the policymakers. Inject reconciliation, forgiveness into the public discourse. We've done that in some work in my past work as well in the past 8 years through KAICEED and others in the region, in the Arab region. We put many social media messages, and I think that's a good path to target the media and bring social media, because it's one of the most crucial and central ways of communication has become in the Arab society. And I think any dent, any influence can be done there will be helpful and can support the reconciliation. Finally, we need positive example. We need role models. The 700 teachers, the Arab teacher we interviewed about forgiveness, we asked them about one role model for forgiveness, and they all came back to the Prophet, peace be upon him, or to Christ, Jesus Christ, al-Masih, or they went back to their, to people in the history of 700-800 years back. When we ask who is your current political leader for forgiveness, religious leader for forgiveness, there were very few. So we need to harness more hope, more positive and role models of forgiveness and reconciliation, though this can be part of the society as well. I mentioned those earlier. So our way forward is a collaborative. Our way forward is, I like this is the Christian Muslim hug in terms of symbolic, also the collective. It's not a matter of individual shaking hands only. It's a matter of the collective being engaged in that. I hope I done. Thank you again for listening. And I know I took a long time. I took 1.5 minutes more than Karim allowed me. So thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Nimr. I think I took 1.5 minutes from your time. So I think you're right on time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this insightful and thought-provoking presentation, Dr. Nimr. This is very, very interesting. So in the amount of time that we have left, we have a number of comments and a few questions in the chat section. And then we have a number of questions in the Q&A section. So perhaps I'll go first through some of the quick comments and questions, relevant comments and questions in the comment section. There were a couple of other comments and questions that perhaps are not specifically relevant to the topic, and I'm hoping that our IIIT colleagues can address those separately. Excuse me. But as far as the other relevant topics in the chat section, there are a few comments around education and the importance of a few comments mentioned that this should be taught in schools. Someone mentioned that this content or this topic is mandatory. I believe in Thailand they mentioned one of the local universities. Someone mentioned that in some U.S. schools teach restorative justice, which is perhaps somewhat similar. So I suppose the question is, Dr. Nimr, how can we introduce this topic from an educational perspective? And I know you've done some work on this as well, and you alluded to some of this in your last slides in terms of the way forward. But how can this be introduced in education systems, particularly perhaps in societies where this topic is difficult to discuss?
Yeah. Thank you, Karim. Thank you. And indeed, I identify education formal and informal because we have had experience in the past 10 years, 15 years, and we trained hundreds of Arab teachers in Jordan. We trained teachers in Egypt. We trained teachers in Israel, Palestine, inside among the Palestinians in Israel as well. And our training always go through at least the 3 phases. The first phase, the teacher is not convinced and helpless, hopeless, don't engage me in this is too political. And then once we move from that and we inspire them, we convince them it's possible, they said, I don't know how to do that. And then we go this through second phase, and we said, okay, here are 3 curriculum for elementary, for middle school, and for high school. This is how you can introduce and design 45 minutes a class on this topic. And then in the third one, then the third phase comes and said, okay, but you know, my principal or my inspector or the ministry will not allow me to do that. And every time we come to that level, we reach this obstacle of the policy of Ministry of Education, of somebody, a boss, somebody in a decision-making place, deciding that the teacher cannot do that. So I'm trying to say 2 main messages here. Let's not assume that the teacher don't want to do that. And let's not assume that there are no informal ways to introduce this. So one suggestion will be, if the government is opposing that, there is always civil society, there is always informal education, there is always other spaces in the society where you can gain access to the students after school. I'm trying to say these are possible ways to introduce this. But at the end of the day, Karim, you're right. The government has to make a decision to introduce this as a mandatory theme. Otherwise, the education system, I mean, imagine a student go through 12 years in the school system and does not learn how to reconcile or forgive other kids if he has a problem with them.
Yeah, I agree, Dr. Nimmer. Thank you for this answer. So let me go through some more comments here. There are a couple of comments that are somewhat related. I think Kevin mentions a case study that they worked on at school, I believe. And I suppose the question, and it's somewhat of a long question, he describes the case. The question, I suppose, is how does reconciliation and forgiveness, how is it impacted by the passage of time? Does it become less important? Does it become less of a priority by the passage of time? An atrocity that took place hundreds of years ago. Is it appropriate? Is a reconciliation model appropriate to discuss this?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question from Kevin as well. But you know, the debate again in international relation and also in the field in general, that there is the model of forget and move forward. Spain is used as one of the amnesia example, where a country can forget what happened during Franco and move on and establish a system. But we know if you look more closely within the Spanish context, there is some people and the groups digging of what happened during that period. But in principle, the guiding principle here, the closer you deal with the injury, the closer you deal with it, the more likelihood that you can restore relationship and prevent further escalation. The longer you allow the sense of victimhood to exist, the more the institution like religion, media, education, politics, the more they begin producing mechanisms and elements to perpetuate the animosity. And the more time it passes, it doesn't mean we forget. I mean, look at what we've done during the Black Lives Matter. What did we do? After 300 years of slavery, we went back and destroyed statues. We asked to change things that existed 300 years ago. So the collective does not forget. Therefore, the closer to the time of injury, although it is difficult, but it will be much easier to prevent further damage, further escalation, further divisions. Again, the conflict will not be as deep-rooted. The more the conflict become deep-rooted, the more difficult it is. I have a family that they did not talk to their daughter for 30 years, 35 years. 35 years you don't talk to your daughter, you forget her face. You forget what does she like. And it's easier for the new generation to dehumanize that person. However, if we deal with that within a year or 2 or 5, this connection that become again easier to deal with and more humanizing, and I think it will be more possible. So the time, I'm one of those who advocate for immediate and short-term relation to the time rather than leave it to the time, because بالعربي, in Arabic we have many says that says, you know, leave it for the time will deal with it. الزمن بقطع, the time will tear it apart, the time
Time is a
will
healer.
time will heal. Again, these are some of the misconception in my view.
Thank you, Dr. Nimr. Well, I think related to that, there's another comment. Who initiates reconciliation? Who's responsible to make the first step or to take the first step?
Yeah, any conflict situation. So, you know, in the husband and the wife, Kareem, who's responsible? Is it the husband or the wife, or the one who committed the offense? In general, people say the one who committed the offense is the one who need to be pursuing and asking and requesting reconciliation and forgiveness. Again, we can go with that rationale, but we know from many places of conflict that the offender is not always in that position to ask, and they are always in a defensive position. At the end of the day, it's an individual decision. It's not who should be doing it. It's whether you, as an individual involved in such relationship, you want to do that, regardless if you are on the offensive side or on the victim side. And sometimes, you know, the lines are not as clear. You think you're a victim, but you will discover through the conversation that you actually had some responsibility to take during this conflict. And therefore, it's very easy to say, oh, I will not reconcile before, it's not my responsibility. And that's the most typical argument we received during our work. It's the offensive, it's the offender, perpetrators' responsibility to ask for forgiveness and to engage in reconciliation. Well, this doesn't happen because he or she or they are the perpetrator, and in their mind and mindset, they have done nothing. So there is no motivation for them to do that. Again, I think it's an individual decision, and it should usually dictated by how important the relationship is for you, Kareem. If the relationship is important and there is what we call interdependency, meaning you will not live without, your life depends, not life in terms of life and death, but you continue to live in a quality of life, good quality of life, depends on that person. That's what we call interdependency. So if the relationship is interdependent and you rely on each other and there are more stakes in the relationship, then it is a mutual responsibility. It's not one person. If the relationship is not important at all, then it could be the offender or the victim. It doesn't matter. The relationship is no matter. If I'm just give a very quick example. If I am traveling in Thailand, you mentioned Thailand, and I am on the street and somebody came and they took my money. And then I found out later on, you know, through the police, if you're lucky, you get your money back and you see the offender, the thief who took my money and caused me a great deal of harm and damage and ruined my vacation and even injured me physically. The relationship with that person is not as important as if this case happened in my neighborhood or within my family or within my country or within my community. And this is what we talk about, interdependent relationship. We know from South Africa, from Liberia and Sierra Leone, the integration of child soldiers who participated in the killing and amputation and even in rape within their own community. And then after the war, they came back and says, we want you to accept us. We want to come in and relive with you as a community. So there is, and these are the children of those communities. There is this dilemma. If you care about the relationship, then it's not one person, one side responsibility. It's mutual and joint.
Everyone is responsible. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nimr. All right, so in the interest of time, we have about 10 or so minutes left, and we haven't gone through the Q&A questions yet. So, and I'm hoping that if we left anything that was unaddressed in the chat, that will be addressed from the Q&A section. So I'll go through some of these questions. I'll read them out, and maybe we can answer them quickly, Dr. Nimr. All right, so a question from Nagwan Sulaiman. After a civil war in a society, does electoral democracy help society to go toward reconciliation and peace? How in Libya, for instance?
Quickly, yes, it depends on the election. It depends on the constitution. It depends if the political agreement is done in a way to promote reconciliation genuinely. Yes, it will help. However, we have seen from other conflict, when the political agreement does not have reconciliation in mind, like in Dayton, in Bosnia, then the perpetuating continue. The same thing in Lebanon and other places. Election alone does not guarantee reconciliation, but they are necessary, but they're not sufficient.
Great. Another question from Maria Lucia. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I would like to know if in your research and work, there was evidence that would support adding another assumption, i.e. reconciliation is a desired state of societies as it is embedded in values and principles found in major religious communities, as well as in humanity through human rights mechanisms. So the idea is, can we consider reconciliation a desired state of societies as an assumption?
Absolutely. And again, in many ways, I agree with Maria Lucia, a colleague of mine and friend that I appreciate her work at Arigato. Arigato did produce a set of values and set of a curriculum that, again, promote the concept of reconciliation, of dialogue, and of peaceful living. All religion, all faith that we're familiar with, call for harmony, for social cohesion, and for reconciliation in a non-violent way. Absolutely. All religions do that. And I apologize, I used only Islam. I use only the Quran. As I said, we're in the month of Ramadan in the Arab society, and I decided to use that. But we're also coming to the Eid for the Christian, Orthodox, and Catholic as well. So Christian, Muslim, Jews, Buddhists, and the Hindus,
Everyone.
all of these faiths call for reconciliation. There is no faith that call for destruction and killing. And that's why culturally it's very feasible.
Thank you for that, Dr. Nimr. Let me just add a follow-on question from Maria Lucia. How can reconciliation happen in situations of state violence that has justified and normalized war against certain groups of the population?
Yeah, again, thank you, Maria Lucia, for but that's the, you know, the 11 countries that I mentioned in the Arab society are all countries and societies and governments that perpetuated this level of violence that always existed. But it's possible. I'll tell you why it's possible, because look at South Africa, it's apartheid system. Look at Northern Ireland, look at Bosnia, look at many parts of the many conflicts around the world in the 90s, at least those three, no one believed and dreamed that they can stop, but they stopped, and the level of violence have significantly been reduced. So yes, it's possible. It's possible because it's possible for people to move together collectively, like what happened in the Arab region in the past 10, 15 years, or since 2010, where masses of people moved together regardless of the outcome. Some people say it's a failed Arab Spring, others says no, it's successful, or whatever it is. Regardless the outcome, that process of a change took place. And that's a message of hope. So yes, Maria Lucia, and also to all the others who think that people can live in violence and violence can prevent them from engaging in reconciliation. I said, yes, temporary, but this should not be the case permanently. And we have many examples. We have We have a huge example in front of us. You know, if Nazi Germany managed to destroy European social fabric and engage in millions of people killed, if European contexts are able to live another 70 years in peace, at least until Ukraine and Bosnia. But there are those possibilities. Let's not, you know, the normalization of violence is what we are dealing with. All of our work in reconciliation and forgiveness is about challenging this notion that violence is a normal behavior and justified, and it's possible to resolve conflict. Our work is exactly against that, is to say violence is not normal, because maybe 200 years ago, we also believed that violence is a normal practice in the family. In some societies, we continue to believe and practice that. But now, today, at least in this part of the world, you can go to jail for disciplining using violence in your disciplinary measures. That change shifted. We lived centuries where we thought black is less than white. It took us a while to understand, appreciate that black is beautiful. And black is liberating. And we also have research. We put our research and we put our faith and religion to perpetuate this racial divisions. So we use religion, we use media, we use politics, we use all this to justify and normalize violence. And our job in reconciliation, forgiveness, to challenge that from within and not expect people from outside to challenge it.
Thank you, Dr. Nimer. We don't have a lot of time left. I have another question from the Q&A section, and I'll try to get to one or two more questions from the chat now. All right, so a question from Naeem. He talks about colonialism, and the question is, can we achieve reconciliation without addressing the power politics of superpowers? And what role colonialism played in creating some of these conflicts, perhaps specifically in the Arab world, but globally as well.
Thank you. I mean, in my book in 2000, I hate to say that, but in my book, but in general, I've already put the thesis out through research and publication that it's easy to blame all the isms for the problems that we have in the house. The house is the Arab society. Yes, colonialism, Zionism, imperialism, all of the isms exist there. All the isms will not have succeeded to influence us in Arab society if the soil was not fertile. There are internal mechanisms in every society that allow colonialism, that allow imperialism, that allow external and foreign agencies to come in and mingle in it. If the social cohesion was strong enough, we will be more resilient. It doesn't mean that the 1,000-mile line between Egypt and Sudan that was created by the British is right. No, it's not right. The colonial powers between 1850 in Algeria and 1961 with the last colonial power in the Arab region, they have historical accountability. And Algeria and France are still dealing with that. That's part of the process of dealing with our internal issues. But this is not the full story. Internally, we have mechanisms of patriarchal system, tribal system, lack of education. We have agencies from within the Arab society that collaborated with the colonial practices. And we see that also in many other conflicts around the world. So that's what the critical self-examination that I talked about earlier. Yes, colonialism is wrong and bad, and did lots of crime against many of the Arab societies. but still we have internal responsibility.
Thank you, Dr. Nimr. Perhaps a related and last question, because we are out of time. Why have we not seen restorative reconciliation in the Arab world or in Arab countries? We've only seen political reconciliation.
I'm not sure even if we had political reconciliation. I think we had political pragmatic agreements, political arrangements, whether it is in Egypt or Tunisia or Iraq. Until now, we have not seen political reconciliation, and it's precisely for the reason I mentioned. It's that again, we have not been able to, in the intelligence language, infiltrate the different social agencies like education, media, politics, for the past, for the past 200 years. That the Arab societies have been under, again, a dominant political arrangements that prohibit these principles of nonviolence, prohibit these principles of reconciliation. It's not, again, I hope the question is not alluding to say, Arab culture is this way, because that's really essentializing it.
Yeah,
it's
no,
the same
just a comment. Yes, just to be fair to the questioner, they're not alluding to that, and she does say political agreement as opposed to reconciliation.
It's similar to what happened in Africa. It's similar to what happened in Central Asia and many other parts of the world. We are part of a humanity that is still struggling in finding ways to reconcile. It's the same situation. Why black and white in the US after 400 years are now dealing with the Black Lives Matters. So technology and the progress and economic prosperity is not a guarantee for reconciliation. It's good condition to allow us to start, but it's not about economics only. It's not about development only. It's about our capacity to be collaborative, humane, connect with each other on that level rather than on the level of the economic development only.
Thank you so much, Professor Nimr, for this amazing presentation and for addressing these comments and questions. We hope we were able to address everyone's comments and questions. We may have missed one or two, but we ran out of time. This presentation is available or will be available. It has been recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel of the International Institute of Islamic Thought. And our colleagues from IIIT have shared the link to the YouTube channel in the chat. So please feel free to check that out. Please stay in touch with IIIT. More webinars are coming up. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Abu Nimr, for this presentation. And we really hope to perhaps host you again sometime soon in the future.
Thank you, Karim. Can I just write, or actually I can put my, you can just go to salaminstitute.org and you can find my contact there. And I'll write it now in the chat for those of you who would like to communicate with me and are interested in working with us on this project of reconciliation and forgiveness in the Arab region in the next few years. And here is my address, abunimr@salaminstitute.org. Thank you, Karim. Thank you, Dr. Nasser. Thank you, everyone. And have a good day and Ramadan Mubarak, and peace be with you. Thank you all.
And with you and everybody, Ramadan Mubarak. To those who are observing, salam to all. Enjoy the rest of your day or night, and see you in our next webinar. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.